After talking in the previous modules about development, IDD, and trauma generally, in Module 3 we're going to go into more detail on the traumatic stress response and how it may impact people with IDD specifically. After completing this module, you should be able to do the following. Identify the types of events that can cause traumatic stress, define several types of trauma-related disorders, and identify ways in which trauma affects people with IDD. The second R of trauma is to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. It is necessary to broaden our understanding of behavior from observable, proximal factors, such as those we can see in the person's immediate environment, to consider the distal influence of trauma and the potential for subtle trauma cues and reminders that might not be readily observed. As we begin, take a moment to think about how you would define traumatic stress. Remember back in Module 2 when we discussed how the type of traumatic event and age at which it occurred is important to understand its effects? When we think about the types of traumatic experience, it can matter whether it was a single traumatic experience, which can range from experiencing an earthquake and being trapped, caught in a robbery or being shot, being in a serious car accident, witnessing violence, or getting threats to actual injury. It's important to take note of disasters or related experiences because people with IDD may be particularly impacted by the physical nature of their disability. For example, if a person is in a wheelchair, their ability to respond or react in the face of a disaster will be affected, and that ability to react or not may influence how he or she responds to the traumatic experience. Experiences that occur together. For example, a person might be in a home where he or she is a witness or a victim of both physical and emotional abuse. Experiences that can extend over time are situations that occur repeatedly over long periods of time. These experiences call forth a range of responses, including intense feelings of fear, loss of trust in others, decreased sense of personal safety, guilt, and shame. An example of this might be living in a dangerous community or being a victim of ongoing abuse. Mass traumas are those that affect entire communities. These may include natural disasters, civil unrest, and epidemics or pandemics. This recording is being made during the global COVID-19 pandemic, while many parts of the country are also experiencing uncontrolled wildfires and civil unrest due to racial injustice. These types of traumas bring complex challenges, not only because they extend over time and include multiple types of trauma, such as isolation, deprivation, actual or feared infection, loss of home, sheltering in place with an abuser, but they affect the entire ecological system. We are only beginning to understand the impact of these events on people with ID and their families, but the effects are expected to be profound and long-lasting. Experiences that are a mixture may be multiple and varied, and include things like living in a domestic violence situation, experiencing a car accident, and having a medical procedure. When a traumatic event involves someone whom the person depends on for caregiving assistance and safety, it creates additional challenges. Additional examples of traumatic experiences that people with ID may face include medical trauma. It's important to note that interactions with primary medical practitioners may in and of themselves be traumatic for people with intellectual disabilities. Medical-related trauma constitutes another important consideration for this population. Given frequent physical comorbidities that may require procedures and invasive physical examinations that the person may have difficulty understanding and communicating his or her feelings about, medical trauma may be an important factor to consider when working with people with IDD. Systems trauma. People with ID and their families may experience repeated discrimination and alienation by the systems that are supposed to be providing them with services. It is important to recognize that traumatic experiences may occur at different time points. For some people, the traumatic experience may occur after the IDD has been diagnosed, at some later point in the person's life. For others, a traumatic experience may be the cause of the disability, or result from treatment related to the disability, such as a traumatic brain injury from a car accident. The type of trauma and the timing of the traumatic experience matters. In this training, we'll discuss how these and other factors play a role in the process of recovery. Life experiences prior to the trauma also affect how the trauma is experienced, as well as the post-trauma recovery. For example, an adult experiencing a car crash who has lived in a nurturing family is going to respond differently from someone who has experienced neglect by the caregiving system early in life. The reactions of others to the trauma can also have profound impacts as well. For example, an adult who discloses sexual abuse and is believed and supported will have different outcomes compared to someone who discloses abuse and is met with disbelief, blame, or shame. Traumatic stress occurs when people personally experience or witness a real or perceived threat to his or her emotional or physical well-being. It is important to distinguish traumatic stress from stress or anxiety. According to mental health experts, a traumatic experience is different from an everyday upsetting event in important ways. A traumatic experience threatens our lives and bodily integrity, such as bodily violation, abuse, or rape. Witnessing a traumatic event that threatens the life or physical security of someone we love can also be traumatic. This is particularly important for people with more severe disability, as their sense of safety depends on their perceived safety of their attachment figures or caregivers. A person's perception of what is traumatic varies by age and developmental stage. Traumatic experiences can initiate strong emotions and physical reactions during its course that persist afterwards. A person may feel terror, horror, or fear. Hearts may pound. Vomiting or loss of bladder or bowel control, feeling stuck in a nightmare, or even passing out can occur. People who experience an inability to protect themselves or lack protection from others to avoid the consequences of the traumatic experience may also feel overwhelmed by the intensity of physical and emotional responses. The body and mind respond with a sense of how serious the event is to the person, and this intensity registers in the person's body and mind. A person's response to an event is based in part on the person's perception of the danger and lack of protective action. As a result, people with IDD may have a lower threshold for what is considered traumatic because they may have a diminished capacity to understand what has happened or to protect themselves. When people have a traumatic experience, they react in both physiological, such as heart rate may increase, they may sweat, feel agitated, they may feel hyper alert, or become emotionally upset. Trauma reactions can include a variety of responses, including intense and ongoing emotional upset, depressive symptoms, anxiety, behavioral changes, difficulties with self-regulation, forming relationships or attachments, loss of previously acquired skills or aggression, attention and academic difficulties, nightmares, physical symptoms such as difficulty sleeping and eating, and aches and pains, among others. People who suffer from traumatic stress often have these types of symptoms when reminded in some way of the traumatic event. At no age are people immune to the effects of traumatic experiences. Even infants and toddlers can experience traumatic stress, and that can affect them into adulthood. Although many of us may experience reactions to stress from time to time, when a person is experiencing traumatic stress, these reactions interfere with his or her daily life and ability to function and interact with others. For people who do experience traumatic stress, there are a wide variety of potential consequences. The way that traumatic stress manifests will vary from person to person and will depend on the person's age and developmental level. Some of these people may develop ongoing symptoms that are diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, which we'll discuss further later in this module. Not everyone who experiences a traumatic event will develop symptoms of traumatic stress. Whether or not a person does depends on a range of factors, such as availability of supportive attachment figures and history of previous trauma exposure. Many people think of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, when they think of trauma. And while PTSD is a common reaction to traumatic stress, there are several other types of reactions that should be considered too. These include reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, and adjustment disorders. First, in order to meet criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD, there must be a certain degree of exposure under direct threat or injury, or witnessing threat or injury, including sexual abuse. This includes learning about serious threat, injury, or violent death to a family member or close friend. Recent studies suggest that exposure to emotional abuse is experienced as life-threatening by young children, and may also produce PTSD symptoms. Second, details of the traumatic event reoccur, including pictures in the mind and physical sensations. There may be nightmares, distressing images, reenactments, or other images of danger to self and family. People may experience intense emotional distress in response to reminders, or may experience renewed physical reactions. In both cases, it may be hard for the person to calm down afterwards. Third, the person may try to stay away from thoughts or feelings about what happened and may try to avoid trauma reminders or the people, places, and activities that are associated with what happened. People do not always have a choice about where to go, who to be with, or hearing what others are talking about, especially people with IDD. They may be frustrated in their effort to avoid painful experiences that can then show up as aggression, withdrawal, constriction of activity and affect, or what seems like oppositional or other challenging behavior. Fourth, the danger, violence, and seeming lack of protection can cause people to expect other bad things to happen, to judge something to be wrong with themselves, or to expect that caregivers will not be able to protect them in ways that they need. People may also continue to feel intense and difficult emotions like fear, anger, guilt, shame, horror, and betrayal. In the face of what happened, they may feel less invested in their own lives and future planning, and markedly lose interest in or stop participating in significant activities. One of the difficulties for people who have experienced trauma is that they may feel alone with their experienced private feelings, and this may lead them to feel different from others. These feelings of difference may lead them to feel detached or estranged. One of the serious consequences of trauma is that it may be more difficult to have happy, satisfying, or loving feelings. Fifth, traumatic experiences can take a toll on how the body continues to react. The sense of needing to be on alert and ready for danger can lead people to have irritable behavior and angry outbursts, including verbal and physical aggression towards people or objects. Rather than avoid situations, people may act more fearless and engage in thrill-seeking or reckless behaviors. This may include self-destructive behaviors. Conversely, they may be on the lookout for danger, which is called hypervigilance, that takes away from being relaxed or being able to attend to enjoyable activities. This may also cause problems in concentration that make learning, working, or other focused activities difficult. People who have experienced trauma are especially vulnerable to sleep disturbances. These may not just include anxieties or worries before bedtime that make it difficult to fall asleep, but quickness to awake to outside noises, restlessness during sleep, and other sleep problems. People who are not getting restful sleep are often irritable and have trouble learning. PTSD can also be associated with dissociative symptoms. These can include depersonalization and derealization. Depersonalization is the feeling of being detached or outside of part or all of one's body, or the feeling or a sense of feeling time moving more slowly. Derealization is a sense of unreality, like the world around oneself is unreal, distorted, or dreamlike. For people with IDD, it may manifest as acting out, aggression, agitation, self-injury, or other disorganized behavior. Depersonalization and derealization may also be symptoms of seizure disorders, so an appropriate diagnosis is important. Acute stress disorder is very similar to PTSD. Acute stress disorder symptoms also include intrusion, such as distressing memories, dreams, dissociative reactions and flashbacks, and distress to cues or reminders, negative mood, including an inability to experience positive emotions, dissociative symptoms, including depersonalization and derealization, or an inability to recall specific details of the event, avoidance of memories, thoughts, or feelings, or of external reminders, and arousal, including irritable behavior, hypervigilance, problems concentrating, sleep disturbance, and exaggerated startle response. The biggest difference is the timing and duration. Acute stress disorder lasts for less than 1 month. Once the symptoms continue beyond 1 month, a diagnosis of PTSD is considered. Reactive disorder, sometimes called RAD, R-A-D, is caused by significant disturbance in one's ability to form healthy attachments to others. It is caused by extreme rearing conditions, such as ongoing abuse, neglect, or institutionalization, occurring in infancy and early childhood, before the age of 5. Symptoms of RAD include consistent pattern of withdrawn behavior towards caregivers, including a lack of developmentally appropriate seeking of comfort when distressed, and a lack of response to comfort when distressed. Persistent social and emotional disturbance, which includes minimal social and emotional responsiveness to others, limited positive affect, and episodes of unexplained irritability, sadness, or fearfulness during non-threatening interactions, not during transitions or trauma reminders, as is the case with PTSD or acute stress disorder, and patterns of extreme neglect or unstable attachment, including social neglect or deprivation, repeated changes in primary caregivers, and rearing in unusual settings that limit attachment. Because the diagnosis of RAD involves patterns of disrupted attachment behavior, it also requires that a person have a developmental level of at least 9 months, when one would expect to have the capacity to develop attachments. Post-traumatic stress and grief reactions can develop into other psychiatric disorders over time. Post-trauma distress can also exacerbate pre-existing mental health problems, including depression and anxiety. Awareness of the broad range of a person's potential reactions to trauma and loss is essential to competent assessment, accurate diagnosis, and effective intervention. However, sometimes people with IDD are misdiagnosed due to a lack of understanding of trauma responses. They may be mislabeled with diagnoses of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, or bipolar disorder, among others, because of the difficulties with mood and behavior regulation that people often display after trauma. Misdiagnoses generally do not capture the full extent of the developmental impact of the trauma. The symptoms leading to misdiagnoses may in fact be a person's reaction to a trauma reminder, which can result in withdrawn, aggressive, reckless, or self-injurious behaviors. For people with developmental disabilities who experience trauma, there are additional challenges in assessing their symptomology. For example, symptoms may change as developmental functions emerge, and so we need to use different measures at different developmental stages depending on their functional level. Caregiver reports are often relied upon during diagnosis, but different caregivers may not agree, caregivers may not be forthcoming, or they may themselves have misperceptions of the causes of symptoms. And current diagnostic criteria may not be appropriate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It is therefore vital that assessments be developmentally guided, grounded on an ecological approach, assessing the functioning of each level of the ecological system, and include a thorough psychosocial history. We'll discuss more about screening and assessment in Module 5. When working with a person with IDD who has experienced trauma, providers need to disentangle responses related to situational stressors and known developmental challenges, medical issues, co-occurring conditions, traumatic experiences, communication challenges, as many providers don't know what to do if a person is nonverbal or has difficulty expressing what has happened or how they feel. People with IDD may have difficulty understanding or expressing or putting into words their emotions or fears. This leads to difficulty in diagnosing and treating a person with communication deficits. And people with IDD often have great difficulty accessing effective supports and services. Right up front, we need to start thinking about using a care coordination or case management approach versus a traditional therapeutic model. The goal is recovery, not just identifying adaptive opportunities or changing behavior. How do agencies and avenues of care adjust to the additional requirements of a person with IDD? Now add on top of that one who has also been traumatized? Caregivers of people with IDD often report unrelenting stress when they cannot obtain the help their loved one needs. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network developed the 12 core concepts for understanding traumatic stress responses in children and families. These concepts guided the original Road to Recovery Toolkit for children with IDD, and we believe these core concepts apply to adults with disabilities, with some modification as well. We'll review each of these concepts in the next slides. Core Concept 1 is complexity. Traumatic experiences are inherently complex. There are many different moments within a single traumatic experience. A person may have to contend with threats to themselves and others. The mind and body of the person are very active in the moment. The person continually appraises the danger, emotionally responds, physically reacts, and considers what is needed to gain protection or to end the threat. A person's reactions are active and dynamic in response to the moment-by-moment changes as the event unfolds. These reactions are influenced by the person's developmental level, prior trauma and loss experiences, culture, and the person's personal strengths and vulnerabilities. The way the person views and responds to the world is often built upon successive layers of expectations about danger, safety, and protection that emerge from a history of multiple trauma and loss experiences. Appreciating the complexity of a person's experience enhances a fuller understanding of the person that is often lost when the person is simply categorized by the type of experience he or she has undergone. For a person with IDD, these moment-to-moment reactions can be even more complex due to the physical or communicative limitations that impact the range of protective actions that were possible during the traumatic experience. Cognitive limitations can alter the understanding and meaning of what is happening. Again, understanding the functional limitations of the person helps to determine the potential impacts. For people with intellectual disabilities, who are vulnerable because they may not appraise danger in the same way that a person with IDD may appraise danger, they may require more supervision or require someone to protect them from danger. They may have difficulty with sequencing events during the traumatic experience. Emotional labeling may be challenging, and how they conceptualize what happened to them could also be limited. People with physical disabilities may be able to understand the danger, but might not be able to do anything about it. Physical limitations might not allow them to be as responsive as they would imagine or want. People with other disabilities, such as sensory or rare conditions, may have different challenges that impact their ability to appraise danger. The question for providers is, how does someone with this set of disabilities understand what happened to them? Another question that may come up for parents or caregivers is how much to explain to the person about what happened to them and to protect them from future danger. For example, if they don't understand what sexual abuse is, how much do they explain? The second core concept is understanding that trauma occurs within a broad context that includes a person's personal characteristics, life experiences, and current circumstances. Trauma occurs within the broad ecology of a person's life that is composed of both intrinsic, or internal, and extrinsic, or external, factors. Intrinsic factors include personal attributes and resources such as age, temperament, developmental attainment, learning from prior experiences, prior exposure to trauma, and prior history of mental illness. Extrinsic factors include the surrounding ecology of family, community, including their current functioning, and available resources and level of threat. These factors help shape a person's expectations regarding danger, protection, and safety. It is important to identify and address these internal and external factors to be able to understand a person's traumatic experience and facilitate their recovery. Are there other factors that you can think of? Why might these impact a person's response to a stressful or traumatic experience? A provider needs to understand the surrounding circumstances of the person with IDD, the ecology of the individual, as opposed to only knowing what happened. For example, only what the traumatic experience was. For the person with IDD, life experience may refer to how IDD affects his or her everyday life. It is important to understand the impact of the traumatic experience within that context. For example, a question might be, what's involved in the person's care related to his or her IDD? What was the context prior to the trauma? Where do IDD and traumatic experiences fit in these circles? The core concept life experience is emphasizing the need to focus on how IDD and the traumatic experiences affect each of these circles: the person, family, provider, and community context. What is their current context? For example, for a person who is in a wheelchair and lives in a violent neighborhood, the context of an assault is different than if the person lived in a safe neighborhood. A person with autism may not read social cues correctly and may misinterpret a benign event or miss one that was damaging. Some adults with severe intellectual delays may have difficulty seeing their experiences as separate from their parents or caregivers. They may believe that what is happening to their caregiver is happening to them. Young adults also experience the world through their caregiving relationships and are profoundly affected and threatened by witnessing trauma experienced by a parent or caregiver. For people with IDD, their vulnerability to the impact of traumatic exposure increases, as they often depend on their caregiving environment and system to protect them and make meaning of traumatic experiences. They are particularly vulnerable when the caregiver's protective, comforting, or regulating capacities are impaired, whether due to the caregiver's own trauma, mental health, staff turnover, or organizational policies. Alternatively, when parents or caregivers are sensitive, attuned, and responsive, they can help buffer the effects of trauma on the person. What events or experiences are they dealing with now? What life experiences have they had related to their IDD in the past? And how might those past experiences, such as being bullied, be influencing their understanding of the current traumatic experience? The third core concept is understanding that traumatic events often generate secondary adversities, life changes, and distressing reminders in a person's daily life. Traumatic experiences can set in motion a cascade of changes in a person's life that can be challenging and difficult. These can include changes in where they live, where they work and socialize, who they're living with, and their daily routines. They may now be living with injury or additional disability to themselves or others. There may be ongoing criminal or civil proceedings. Traumatic experiences leave an aftermath of reminders that may persist for years. These reminders are linked to aspects of the traumatic experience, its circumstances, and its aftermath. They may be reminded by persons, places, things, situations, anniversaries, or by feelings, such as renewed fear or sadness. Physical reactions can also serve as a reminder. For example, increased heart rate, bodily sensations, or feelings of pain may bring back a flood of memory of the traumatic experience. This is particularly important because these internal cues may not be readily apparent to caregivers and may be missed in a traditional behavioral analysis. They may appear to come out of the blue, when in reality something is triggering a traumatic memory. Identifying the person's responses to trauma and loss reminders is an important tool for understanding how and why their distress, behavior, and functioning often fluctuates over time. Trauma and loss reminders can reverberate within families, among friends, in the workplace, and across communities in ways that can powerfully influence the ability of adults, families, and communities to recover. Addressing trauma and loss reminders is critical to enhancing ongoing adjustment. For a person with IDD, adults with IDD and their families may have already had to find a way to cope with secondary adversities related to IDD. Trauma may add to these significant secondary adversities related to IDD, such as more appointments, criminal proceedings, adult protective service involvement in investigations. The combination can further tax already stressed coping resources of the person and their caregivers. A trauma reminder is anything that an individual unconsciously attaches to the memory of a trauma. It can be anything, from a place, smell, sound, thing, or person. Individuals can have the same responses, reactions to a reminder as the actual traumatic event itself. It is not uncommon for typically developing adults or adults with IDD to have difficulty communicating their distress in words when they encounter trauma reminders. Instead, the distress is expressed through behavior. Sometimes, as in Billy's situation in the example, through disruptive behavior. This illustrates an important maxim: all behavior is communication. The fourth core concept is understanding that people can exhibit a wide range of reactions to trauma and loss. A person can remain fearful, anxious, sad, guilty, ashamed, and related behaviors. Given the complexity of trauma and loss experiences, adults may manifest their distress through a range of reactions, including post-traumatic stress, dissociation, grief, depression, separation anxiety, among others. These reactions may include bodily sensations and physical symptoms like nausea, stomach aches, headaches, muscle tension, and fatigue. In the immediate aftermath, there are various reactions. Over time, a person's distress reactions may decrease, or instead consolidate into a formal mental health disorder. The challenges of secondary adversities and life changes may intensify the person's reactions to traumatic experiences. They may also contribute to an important secondary source of distress for adults that may lead to additional worries, demoralization, depression, behavioral problems, and substance abuse. In addition, adults with pre-existing mental health conditions may be especially vulnerable to experiencing an exacerbation or renewal of symptoms. It is important to understand how these reactions and symptoms may take a toll on a person's daily functioning and developmental progression. It's also important to take into account how a person's developmental level may influence their expression of distress. The disturbances in development can include loss of developmental achievements, disturbances in their ability to establish relationships, disturbances in developing sense of self, disturbances in physiological stress response system, disturbances in affect expression and regulation, interference with readiness to take on new developmental tasks, or inappropriate behavior that introduces significant risk. For a person with IDD, traumatic experiences need to be understood in light of the intellectual disability. For example, the response of the adult may look more like what a provider would expect from a younger child. An adult with IDD may be trying to communicate about his or her traumatic experience, yet a provider may see it as a behavior challenge related to the disability. If the provider only tries to manage the behavior and doesn't address the underlying traumatic experience, it could exacerbate the person's trauma response. In addition, adults with very limited communication, distress may be signaled by exacerbation of an old behavior, like screaming or headbanging, or increase of a nonspecific behavior, like pacing. Trauma and loss experiences can interact with other behaviors, such as aggression, that disrupt fragile gains in impulse control that have already been made. For example, perhaps the aggression was a behavior that was being successfully addressed, and then the traumatic experience occurred and reignited the behavior. Adults may lose hard-won gains in functioning, which can feel devastating for them as well as their caregivers. For another example, perhaps parents or caregivers worked with the adult with IDD to achieve a positive identity and acceptance of a certain threshold of behaviors. However, following an experience of sexual abuse, the person is now acting out sexually, such as masturbating in public. The caregivers may have accepted the person's acting out behaviors before, but now has to set limits, and this can be confusing for the person and challenging for the caregivers. The fifth core concept is that danger and safety are primary concerns in the lives of people who have had traumatic experiences. Issues of danger, protection, and safety are paramount considerations in dealing with adults and caregivers who have had traumatic experiences. People in society expect and depend on a protective shield to keep them safe from danger. When traumas occur, everyone experiences a failure in this protective shield. Trauma and loss experiences often create uncertainties about the likelihood of future danger, harm, and loss. It can take a person, parent, or other caregivers and a community a significant amount of time to restore a sense of safety. Practical steps are important to restoring safety and protection, but restoring confidence in the protective shield can take much longer. These concerns can affect ongoing perceptions of threat and behavioral responses often elicited by traumatic reminders. For a person with IDD, in the aftermath of a traumatic experience, people and caregivers alike want to have a protective shield against danger. Traumatic experiences challenge a person's sense of a protective shield against danger, and restoring confidence and safety can take quite some time. Oftentimes, traumatic experiences threaten the ability to trust in the protective shield. The person with IDD is looking to caregivers to provide a protective shield, and caregivers may be looking to the community to provide a protective shield. During that time, the person and caregivers may be concerned about whether they will appropriately recognize future dangers, know what to do, and be physically able to protect themselves. The sixth core concept is traumatic experiences affect the family and broader caregiving system. As a stone thrown in a pond creates a ripple, some bigger and closer, others smaller and further. Adults with IDD are deeply embedded within their families, homes, workplaces, and communities. Caregiving systems are challenged in two interconnected ways. First, these symptoms are challenged by how to respond to the changes in the person brought about by the person's traumatic experiences, losses, and adversities. Second, caregivers, family members, friends, and members of the community are often also changed by traumatic experiences and losses. They bring their own life experiences, sets of reactions, and concerns that can further complicate their ability to support and respond to traumatized and bereaved people with IDD. Level of exposure, extent of loss, frequency of reminders, and cascade of adversities all have an effect on the capacity of the caregiving system to function and meet their own needs as well as those of the traumatized person. It is important to understand the types and amounts of caregiving resources and how these resources have been affected. Again, we know that traumatic experiences impact the entire ecological system and vice versa. We previously discussed how the larger ecological system affects the individual's responses to trauma. Here, we are discussing the way in which trauma may affect the larger ecological system, which then impacts a person's post-trauma response. For a person with IDD, caregivers may feel devastated by what happened to the person with IDD. They put so much effort into protecting him or her, and yet the traumatic experience still occurred. It may be especially hard for them to find trauma treatment and trauma-informed systems because of the person's disability. The person, family, and caregiving system may feel overwhelmed by the specific needs of that person and family, which are over and above the needs related to the person's IDD that they may already have. This may impact the sources of support that are made available. The seventh core concept is protective and promotive factors can reduce the adverse impact of trauma. Protective factors buffer against the harmful effects of traumatic experiences and their aftermath. The affected person brings intrinsic qualities, such as temperament, to their efforts to adjust and adapt. An anxious person may too quickly jump to catastrophic thoughts in the face of a reminder and have difficulties accepting reassuring information, whereas another person may seek and use outside support to calm themselves. Individuals may draw upon prior successes and adapting to hardship. Protective factors are also external to the person. For example, while it may take time to restore confidence in the protective shield, often appropriate and timely protective steps can be taken to protect against future dangers that are essential to addressing a person's concerns. With an enhanced sense of safety and security, people can benefit more from a host of promotive factors. Promotive factors are inherent resources in the person and within the person's physical environment that help propel a person towards healthy development, including the capacity to adapt to challenging or changing circumstances. These constitute the beneficial ingredients that foster the social, physical, and emotional growth of a person. People thrive in enriching learning and emotional environments with stable and engaged caregivers, friends, and mentors. Replenishing and reinforcing these external resources helps a person to cope with their post-traumatic and grief reactions, to handle adversities, and to reinvest in their own developmental progression. People with IDD may already be experiencing multiple adversities related to IDD. The person and caregivers may feel that protective factors have been spent buffering the effects of the IDD. Providers' reassurance that strategies for addressing the effects of traumatic experiences can be adapted for adults with IDD by enhancing protective factors is essential. Adults with IDD may be limited in their ability to seek support when they need to, make their own needs known, or have others take protective action on their behalf. These are all protective factors that are potentially less immediately available to some adults with IDD. Providers can work with parents or caregivers to enhance attachment and create a safe and healing environment. The eighth core concept, trauma and post-trauma adversities can strongly influence development. Development represents a complex process of acquiring sets of competencies and attaining achievements that unfold across multiple domains over time. Traumatic events and outcomes can injure and put important developmental areas at risk as they mature through early childhood to late adolescence or into adulthood. These injuries have great variability and can cause developmental interruptions, delays, cessations, regression, and precocious developmental acceleration. The traumatic event and consequences of the event cause a hit on developmental processes as they occur at key times in the person's life. We want to be able to help the person to thrive and achieve their developmental potential. According to current developmental level and their developmental level at the time of the trauma, adults with IDD may have concerns about separation and attachment, psychosexual issues, physical appearance and injury, peer acceptance or rejection, and implications for their future. Because traumatic experiences may happen during significant developmental transitions, trauma can put these important developmental goals and achievements in jeopardy. Therefore, it is important to understand how trauma experienced in childhood may have affected the development of an adult with IDD and how that influences their current experience. For a person with IDD, traumatic experiences may result in a significant setback in developmental progress, which was already challenged by IDD. The ninth core concept is that developmental neurobiology underlies a person's reactions to traumatic experiences. The brain is active and always taking in information from the world around us, putting us on alert for danger, and calculating the best actions to take in response. A person's capacity to appraise and respond to danger are linked to an evolving neurobiology that consists of brain structures, neurophysiological pathways, neural circuits, and neuroendocrine systems. Beyond fight or flight, when it comes to danger, trauma, and loss, the brain is a social brain. It is set up to seek prevention, protection, effective intervention, and rescue, for example, by evoking and responding to cries of distress. The brain strives to learn something from what happened. The biology of remembering includes opportunities for reappraisal, reframing, and consideration of additional protective interventions. It also includes learning how to live in a world filled with reminders. The brain offers way to temper the danger responses, especially those evoked by reminders, while learning to adapt to future dangers and challenges. From early childhood through young adulthood, the brain matures in order to help achieve successive developmental tasks. At any point in time, trauma can cause changes in neurobiology that can affect a person's capacity to negotiate the world around them, function at their best, and move forward in their development. It is important to understand how adaptive responses can become maladaptive responses over time and adversely affect relationships, behavior, and health. For a person with IDD, neuromotor and physical aspects of IDD may affect how they appraise and respond to danger. Some of the development of the nervous system that is responsible for appraising and responding to danger may not be as advanced in adults with IDD. Additionally, a traumatic experience can further impact maturation. At the same time, problems like sleep disturbances may really compromise daytime attention and functioning. Cognitive limitations can alter the understanding and meaning of what is happening. Again, understanding the developmental perspective of the person helps to determine the potential impacts. Other IDD-specific features may alter presentation of traumatic stress symptoms. For example, hearing, vision, communication, and movement problems may affect behavior. The 10th core concept. Culture is closely interwoven within traumatic experiences, responses, and recovery. Considerations of culture are important to understanding all of the core concepts. People with IDD and their caregivers must be understood from the vantage point of multiple cultural influences, whether the society at large, their local community, specific group affiliations, or that of their own individual family. Cultures shape meanings, beliefs, and expectations that govern attitudes, norms, behaviors, and social interactions. Culture can be used as a lens for understanding the ways in which a person and their family experience and express distress, disclose personal information, exchange support, and seek help. Culture is used to navigate life's challenges, including how to interpret danger, protection, and safety, to consider the personal consequence of a traumatic experience, and to pursue paths towards recovery. Shame, guilt, acceptance, and exclusion are all infused within culture. Human response to death provides one of the strongest examples of the power of culture in terms of bereavement, mourning, and grief. A cultural group's experiences with historical or multi-generational trauma can serve as a vivid backdrop to current trauma and loss experiences, enhance a sense of shared experience with prior generations, add to expectations regarding self, others, and social institutions, and offer motivation to share in the pursuit of protective interventions and justice. For a person with IDD and their family, they are often a part of multiple cultural identities and communities, including disability communities. All of these cultural identities are important to understand as part of the person's response to what happened and being able to recognize strengths and sources of support. It is important to recognize that sometimes cultural values and beliefs are congruent with our own, and at other times they are not. The 11th core concept is challenges to the social contract, including legal and ethical issues, affect trauma response and recovery. There are laws and regulations governing every level of society to ensure safety and protection. There are social institutions such as law enforcement, judicial systems, adult service systems, disaster preparedness and response agencies, and many others that are integral to upholding the social contract. Because traumatic stress involves a failure or violation of the protective shield for people with disabilities, there is an inseparable link to the wider social contract. Whether one is speaking about maltreatment, domestic violence, community or school violence, natural disaster, or catastrophic accidents, questions always arise about prevention and protection, effective intervention, timely and appropriate rescue, quality medical or mental health attention, and sufficient resources to promote recovery. These issues involve legal, moral, and ethical considerations. It is common for traumatized people and their families to interface with one or more of these social institutions. These interactions make a strong impression on the person. The nature of these interactions, as well as the person's response to them, are both important to understanding the overall circumstances surrounding traumatic experiences or loss. A person with IDD's understanding of the social contract and the role of social institutions undergoes its own developmental course and may need to be revisited over time as it affects the person's sense of morality, attitudes regarding parenting, prosocial values, and citizenship. Enforcing, restoring, and upholding these social contracts is part of the reparative work of intervening in the aftermath of traumatic stress. For the person with IDD, the report of a traumatic experience by the person with IDD may not be believed. Adults with IDD and families may encounter the false belief that people with IDD don't or can't experience trauma. Caregivers often have to deal with many social agencies in order to obtain services to meet the needs related to the family member's IDD. People with IDD may have experienced significant disparities in access to services and supports. They may have experienced lost income, painful choices, such as food versus copays, and unresponsive private insurance and public systems. Their views of fairness, justice, and the roles and responsibilities of society, already challenged by IDD, may be compounded by traumatic experiences. What we're really talking about here is the impact of the community in the ecological model that we've discussed many times. How do the attitudes of the community and broader society about disability, such as stigma, impact the person with IDD and family? How does it affect their ability to seek support and justice? The 12th core concept for understanding traumatic stress responses in adults with IDD is understanding that working with trauma-exposed people can be extremely rewarding. However, this work can also evoke distress in providers for a number of professional and personal reasons. Providers must confront disturbing situations involving the person and families affected by trauma and loss experiences. A multitude of adversities and violations of the social contract, including failure of the protective shield. In order to be the most helpful, providers must be open to hearing everything the person has to say. They are privy to some of the most intense, horrific, and difficult experiences. This can be emotionally demanding and challenging. From an individual to an organizational level, it is important to ensure a sense of professional accomplishment rather than induce a sense of futility, bolster self-care that prevents emotional exhaustion, and to receive organizational support that values the work and addresses the many practical issues that can otherwise cause serious professional distress. Working with traumatized people can evoke strong personal memories of trauma and loss-related experiences that must be properly attended to and respected. Any individual who works directly with traumatized people is vulnerable to the effects of trauma, referred to as secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue, being physically, mentally, and emotionally worn out or feeling overwhelmed. Practicing self-care requires an active effort on the part of the clinician and/or service provider. Doing so entails developing strategies for prevention and intervention, and these include, but are not limited to, psychoeducation, clinical supervision, ongoing skills training, self-care groups, implementing ways of evaluating secondary stress, caseload adjustment, and referrals to outside sources of help. For a parent or caregiver or a provider of an adult with IDD, traumatic events may re-evoke their concerns about the vulnerability of the person with IDD that they support and their own ability to protect the person from harm. For providers, hearing about the person's traumatic experience and coping with responses may evoke strong personal memories and feelings for caregivers and providers as well. We'll talk more about this in Module 6 when we discuss ways to promote provider self-care.